Hi there, it's Ian here, and you're watching Grumpy Opinions, the show where I'm going to tell you all about what I think of films, TV shows, games, and life in general. Let's get on with the show. Star Trek Discovery is a Star Trek universe show about science officer Michael Burnham on the experimental ship, the Discovery, her adventures with her crew in space and the future, now starting on Season 2. But if you missed Season 1, there's a recap video which I'll link below. Episode 1, Brothers, starts off with a wee bit voiceover from Michael, talking about an old African legend about a girl throwing ash into the night sky to make the Milky Way. And then we get to see her as a little girl, and she's being introduced to like her foster mum Amanda and her new brother Spock, and he makes a giant hologram snake and then acts a bit like a grumpy wee dick towards her. Then we're back at like the end of where Season 1 finished, and then there's like the famous Enterprise 1701, you know, the one from the original Star Trek series, and it sends a distress call. And it turns out that they're all kind of broken down, but they get a message to them eventually, and Captain Pike wants to beam over with his engineer and a science officer. But when they arrive, it turns out the science officer isn't Spock, it's like some pasty white dude. And it turns out that like, Captain Pike has been ordered to take over the captaincy for the time being, because there's been like a major emergency. So he gets up to the bridge and introduces himself and like gets to know all the names of everyone, and then they're off to look at some kind of weird space anomaly that they've tracked, which is part of a group like that randomly appear but don't make much sense and can't really be tracked somehow apart from this one, but they've somehow managed to break the Enterprise as well. Like when they were actually chasing towards it, the Enterprise just broke. So now they need to investigate. Meanwhile, Stamets is still pining over his dead boyfriend who got dead last season. Ouch. And he's distracted when like Tilly tells him that she's setting up a science room for him, and it turns out that he can't actually stand to be in the ship now, and he's gotten himself a teaching job in Vulcan, and as soon as the mission with Captain Pike's over, he'll go there. And she's kind of sad about that, but that's just how it goes. And Burnham's also reminiscing, but she's reminiscing about growing up and like reading Alice in Wonderland, and like then her dad pops by and has a bit of a chat about how he has to leave to set up a task force to examine these anomalies, and then they chat a bit about Spock. And she's a bit vague and mysterious, and it's clear that her and Spock have some kind of falling out at some point, but they agree it's not really the time to discuss it. So then the ship gets to the anomaly and they find like loads of broken up asteroids, and then they spot like a crashed Federation ship in one of the asteroid bits, and they realise that they should probably check it out. But as they get a bit closer, something weird happens that pushes them back, and it sends the asteroid hurtling towards a star, and it looks pretty hopeless because they can't beam down or take a shuttle because of reasons. But then luckily Burnham has a plan, because the Discovery has experimental launch ship things that she was a test pilot for at some point, and of course she's an expert in flying them, even though this has never been mentioned before. But then anyway, they all zoom out into space and it's cool and everything, but it's also difficult, and Burnham keeps giving advice, but like the pasty white guy isn't having it, and oh he's dead, oh well. But also Captain Pike gets a crack on his windscreen from a stone chip. I hate when that happens. And then his helmet doesn't work properly. And then Michael sets up like a daring plan that she's going to eject and help him eject, and then his helmet finally works, so he ejects and she ejects, and they end up safely not getting dead. And in the wreckage they find like flying robot things, and they lead them down a corridor, and they meet like a quirky engineer who's kind of reminiscent of like Holtzman from Ghostbusters. What? And then she's like keeping a whole load of injured officers alive, and she thinks the war's still on, but luckily they managed to get the crew into the beamy bit of the ship, and they set up like science to make it work properly despite the fact they're on an asteroid. And then Michael's like fiddling with the cable, but she doesn't get beamed up, and then she has to like run because everything's exploding, and then she gets blown up a bit, and then she's okay apart from a wee bit of shrapnel in the side of her leg. And then she thinks she sees an angel, but it turns out it's only Pike, and he grabs her, and just before they can beam away, she picks up a chunk of the asteroid, but it doesn't come through the transport with her. And back on the ship, she's telling Tilly about this magical rock, and Tilly's off to like capture some more because it's apparently like special and she needs to study it with science, and like even Stamets is quite keen to help, so they end up getting a really big stone in the cargo bay and everyone's happy. And after that, it's like back to meet up with the Enterprise again. And Pike and Michael have like a nice chat about him getting a nicer, like less Orca-esque office, and then also they talk a bit about Spock, and it turns out that he's not actually on the Enterprise, he took a load of leave, like months of it, and Burnham pops over the Enterprise and goes into his quarters on a hunch, and she finds like the wee snake drawing thing from earlier, and a message saying that he's been having nightmares about something, and he's gone off to like investigate it, and she uses the hologram thing, and she sees that he's actually off investigating the anomaly. Wow. And wasn't it just like her throwing ash into the sky to make the stars? Symbolism. So what did I think? Well, to give a wee bit of background before I start, as I said in the recap video a bit, I wasn't the biggest fan of Season 1 Discovery. I mean, I think it was a bit showy, a bit too loud and actionary, not really classic Star Trek, but, without the whole sort of crew working together thing that I really loved about it. I mean, it was a bit too much about Michael Burnham and stuff and her plight, and I didn't think she was a very likeable character. And the show was a wee bit po-faced and grim, and it wasn't that much fun. And Star Trek's always kind of felt fun, or at least hopeful to me. And I'm not, apparently I'm not alone in thinking that, and partly because, nothing's made in a vacuum, not even a space show. Oh dear. Anyway, Discovery came out. There was also, there's been the movies, and they've slightly changed what people think about it, and it's definitely a little more in line with them than it is with the old shows. And then, but at the same time, the Orville came out, and if you've not seen the Orville, it's basically a TV show that's kind of like a love letter to Star Trek: The Next Generation. The one with Picard in it, and that's been made by Seth MacFarlane, like the guy who made Family Guy and American Dad. But despite the fact that it's actually quite a good show, it feels in a lot of ways like classic Star Trek, and a lot of fans kind of prefer it, and I kind of prefer it a wee bit too, even though it is a bit silly at times and sometimes the plots don't make a lot of sense. But it feels a bit like with this show that season two's clearly been written with a few of these criticisms in mind. And in a lot of ways, there was like one massively Orville-esque joke in this episode where they go into a lift, and I mean, everything about the staging of that and the camera angles and like the funny looking alien, and he's got a cold and he sneezes on someone, made it plain that that was a bit of levity, and it kind of worked. I mean, it felt a little bit out of place, but it's clear that they've realised that they can't be quite so grim and po-faced, and they've got to add a little comedy and humour to it. It's also clear that like the show hasn't skimped on any effects or any of the shooting budget or anything like that. I mean, the whole show, it looks amazing. I mean, it's brilliantly shot. The music's great. The effects and sounds are all great. The cinematography, the score, like the sets are all amazing. I mean, absolutely. Apart from a couple of wee editing issues I might mention later, there's literally nothing about this that I thought was bad. So I mean, props to literally to the props department and the costume and everyone else, because I think they did really well. Also, props to Anson Mount, or Ansu Mount. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Anyway, he joined the show as Captain Pike. I mean, you might remember him from like he was in that Britney Spears movie that was out a few years ago, and to be honest, that's about the only thing I can actually think where I've actually seen this guy before. But anyway, he's like Captain Pike, who was the original Starship Enterprise captain from like the original pilot of the original series, and the character was also seen on the recent Star Trek films, played by Bruce Greenwood. So you might have seen him on that. So he's kind of an established character, So we've got a sense of him. He's a good, solid captain and officer. So it's nice to see that they've stayed consistent with that. Although he's a character that's not that well known and hasn't been on that much of it. Since, let's face it, in the original series, he was really only seen as being a kind of melted-looking guy in a recycling bin. So it's good that they can do what they like with the character, but as long as keeping him kind of slightly consistent. And they seem to be doing it okay. It's also interesting that they've been setting up mysteries for this season. I mean, we've just had the end of the war and the end of the last season, so I can't see them doing another war. But this time there's some sort of like big space mystery. I mean, what are all these red lights around the galaxy? What do they do? Who made them? Are they sentient? Are they part of an alien weapon? I mean, did they manage to zap out and break the Enterprise, or did they? Or was that a coincidence? Was that someone else? And why has Spock been having nightmares about them? And where's Spock gone? These are a lot of interesting questions to kind of bring up, and it's a good thing to put them in the first episode of a season, so you've got something that carries you onwards with the rest of the story. And there was also some fantastic action in this, including like a space sequence that was like a chase that was really well made. But that's also where I start having issues with it. And kind of the launchcraft sequence kind of ties into a lot of them. So, I mean, bear with me here. But right off the bat, right, I didn't have an issue with the concept of the sequence. But here's the thing, right? They establish in dialogue that you can't land, you can't beam down, you can beam back because you've got like, you can put down enhancing things to actually make it work better. But you can't beam straight down there. So they've got these wee glass pods that you can zoom about with. But they're kind of like rickety wee things, and they're not that strong, and they're apparently difficult to control. But what did they do? They put three people who've never been trained in them before into them, including the ship's captain. I mean, and they've technically got both science officers and an engineer, because they've got the science officer and the main engineer from the Enterprise in this as well. So that's a away party of incredibly ridiculously high-ranking folk. I mean, I know that's always been a thing in Star Trek, so I mean, it's never really been something that you really quibble about, but it just seems silly, especially when you think they would take Burnham's supposed to be trained in these things. You think they would take her and a couple of other people who actually had been trained in them, and maybe the captain or maybe like the engineer or something. But anyway, all these people are supposed to go without any warning straight into these things, without even having an hour to actually familiarize themselves with the controls, and just go zooming straight out there. It seemed a bit strange and a bit careless. And of course, it all goes to pot. I mean, and that's fine as well, because you've got rising action and high stakes and stuff, because otherwise you've got no tension. But then, right, they get to this point, right, once they eject at the end, and watch this.
Exceeding maximum thrust!
Burnham, do you copy?
Discovery, this is Burnham. We have touchdown.
Right, did you see what was wrong there? Okay, it showed that they survived, but then it cut back and tried to make it look like there was suspense. Why didn't it just cut back to them, and then you wouldn't know if they'd actually stopped in time before they hit the spikes? That's how you would cut something like that together. So it's weird, because it's not like we really care what the bridge crew thought about it, because we've just seen that they managed to stop before they get to the spikes. So it just seemed a bit silly. And interesting, there was another minute a wee bit later, like when the engineer, like Holtzman, tells them basically that they should hurry up and follow the flying robots.
Don't just stand there, follow the kids, come on!
But the robots hadn't actually moved yet in the shot, so she's saying, oh, hurry up and follow them, but she hasn't actually moved them. So why would she say that then? Surely they would move and then she would say that. I mean, it's a wee thing, it's an editing issue, but it's strange. Another thing was that there was that wee homage to The Martian. I mean, I don't know, maybe it was just me, but I straight up felt like this was exactly the same as the bit, where he wakes up on Mars after he's been stranded. Another thing was during the space chase bit, they killed off the pasty white guy, Connolly. Now, here's the thing, right? There's a game you can play when you're watching any film and TV show called Spot the Stiff, and this goes back to Spot the Stiff was come up by it was a comedy show at one point, but they pointed out that you're watching a film, you can usually tell who's going to die because of the sometimes it's really cliched and obvious. So like in a war film, if somebody says,
"When this war's over, I'm going to settle down with my little girl Maisie in a country pub." Dead.
If you're watching a cop film and then some guy says, "Oh, I'm going to retire just next week or in a couple of days," spot the stiff. And in this episode, literally about 10 minutes into it, I'd spotted that this guy Connolly was going to die. Why? Because he was the only character who straight off the bat didn't actually get on well with Burnham. Like immediately, she says something and he sort of takes offense.
The metaphor seemed a bit simplistic.
I believe it's a simile.
And then he basically grumps at her, and then constantly from the rest of it, he's the one, everyone else is chuckling at her jokes, and he's kind of big scornful and sarcastic, and he ends up literally mansplaining to her at the end why he isn't going to take her advice, even though she's the expert pilot in these spaceships. And then he's literally mansplaining to her about how he used to tell his old flatmate that she was wrong, and then he gets hit by a rock. And what's funny is they've put him in a blue shirt, and they actually had Pike say to the other person,
Get your red shirt into an EV suit and on, you're with us.
Now, and that's a running gag in Star Trek, because red shirts were always the ones who died, and that's kind of, you've probably heard of it, like people talking about red shirts and things. And I'm guessing that was supposed to be a subversion of that expectation, only it didn't really work because the show tries so hard to make it sure that you didn't like him that it was obvious that he was going to be the one that was going to die. I mean, I would have been genuinely shocked if she'd die and he'd survived, because that would have been a bit strange. But also and this might sound a wee bit blunt, but it feels like these days, like most modern TV shows are so progressively forward-looking that they've got like female leads and a very diverse cast and things, and that's all great, But it feels like a show like this wouldn't kill off a non-white female character when they've got a pasty white dude who's being condescending standing right next to her. It just feels like that's what happens now on TV. So it's too obvious and it's too well constructed, and stuff that's obvious I find kind of boring because I can predict it's going to happen, and like this, literally predicted it was going to happen. Other than that, I still find Tilly really grating. I mean, the character of Tilly's, she's supposed to be this slightly hyperactive girl who's only a trainee and stuff, but she's just happy to be there. She's really excited and happy to be there, and I'm sure the actress is fine, but the character's so jittery and annoying that every time she's on screen, I feel like I'm watching like Wesley from The Next Generation, but if Wesley was a girl who was incredibly socially awkward and kind of annoying. And more than that, I still don't like Michael Burnham. Michael Burnham's still the dullest protagonist ever. She's too good at everything. She's always right, even when she's wrong, because then it always turns out that she was later on that she was right. And then she's always the focus of every episode when the show used to be a big ensemble. I mean, I basically said that at the beginning, and the same as this. And then it's always now just the sad story of her being this misunderstood genius who, is human and raised by Vulcans, and that makes it difficult for her to really know her place in things. But then she still goes around like giving like meaningful like comments and lectures to people who are much older and more experienced than her, and they just sort of stop and knowingly kind of nod their heads, because she's so wise. And it's just a bad character, frankly. It's a bad character that you're just supposed to think, oh, she's so put upon, but isn't she great? And isn't it great that she's always right and she can always just go, well, I'm right. Anyway, it annoys me a bit. And I didn't hate it this week. I mean, the show's not terrible. Some things are kind of better this time around than last season, but I'm worried that it's going to continue to be just as badly written as it was. And bad writing, as you know, really bugs me. But still, I'm happy to keep going with it. I'll see how the season pans out. So till next time, I've been Ian, and these have been my grumpy opinions.